Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So apologies, my voice is still in the process of recovering, but I've got some stronger drugs now, so hopefully it's on the road to being mended. What I want to say in this short video, hopefully, is a couple of points, a couple of problems with reenactment. Now, I don't want this to be seen as a general kind of anti-reenactment rant at all. It's not. I've got lots of time and respect for reenactment, and I've taken part in reenactment of a few different periods in my life. I've never been a full-time reenactor because basically I got into HEMA at a fairly young age, and that didn't leave any spare time for reenactment on the side. But essentially, reenactment does lots of things really well. It's certainly good at giving an insight into massed kind of battle type tactics and such like. However, there are a couple of points, a couple of issues that I've always had with where reenactors have spent many years reenacting, and they have come to view themselves as experts on certain weapons. And in some cases they are, in some cases they've got a lot of experience using certain weapon sets. However, there are two problems that I often find myself running up against when I'm having discussions with reenactors and weapon use. The first one of those is face hits. Okay, now the problem is in HEMA, for example, we wear fencing masks, and a lot of attacks in fighting manuals and treatises are aimed at the face. Particularly with, if we take for example spears, when I do spear fighting, whether it's spear and shield or spear alone, the face is a really important target to be able to stab at. And this goes for whether you're an attacker, whether you're the one stabbing, or whether you're the stabbee or the stabbed, essentially. Okay, if you're not used to people stabbing at your face, you're not really experiencing spear fighting as it was done. Okay, the face is, especially if shields are involved. If shields are involved, the major targets are the head or face and the legs, essentially. And if you're not really being thrust in your face on a regular basis, you're not really experiencing that style of combat. Equally, if you are not stabbing at the person's face on a regular basis, you're not really experiencing that style of combat. Now, in terms of practice, fencing masks are obviously a modern invention. We don't really know exactly how they practice without fencing masks in historical periods before the 19th century or before the mid-18th century. However, there are some clues, one of those being, if we look at Joseph Swetnam from 1617, we can see that he recommends padded balls to be fitted on the end of both rapiers and quarterstaves to allow more safe thrusting. So it's possible that they just simply used essentially a padded end to a stick, and trained like that, and probably took hits to the face, but the padded ball is supposed to be big enough so it can't enter the eye socket. So first of all is face shots. The second point that comes up from reenactors that I often, well, not so much as a point that comes up from reenactors, but a point that's underlying a lot of perception about weapon use in reenactment, is that essentially the weapons they use are often not very accurate to the actual real weapons. This is particularly true. It's not so true of things like pikes and polearms, although pikes and polearms tend to be used in a completely different way in reenactment to how you would actually use them if you were trying to wound someone. If we look at pike fighting in English Civil War sort of simulations, reenactments, then usually they're not actually aiming to stab each other with the pikes, obviously, because that would be dangerous, especially with just a helmet and no face protection. So they're not using pikes how pikes would be used. If we look at how a bill or a halberd would be used, they're not really used realistically in most reenactment. Maybe if we look at kind of Battle of the Nations type stuff, then maybe they're using polearms more realistically, but they're using complete armour, so they're not really using them realistically because they're not aiming to bypass the armour, and of course the weapons aren't sharp and they're not allowed to thrust with them most of the time, so they're not really using them realistically either. So a billet or a halberd is given predominantly thrusting, often at the face again, or for whopping great blows against someone who's not wearing very much armour. And of course you can't do this in reenactment either. But particularly the point that I wanted to make about reenactment weapons is swords. And reenactment swords have a reputation. You know, have you ever noticed, for example, we don't tend to use reenactment swords in HEMA? Why is that? Because they tend to be too heavy, they tend to be too stiff to safely thrust with, and they tend to just essentially be not very like real swords. The swords that we prefer to use tend to be what reenactors will probably call semi-sharp, but equally they tend to be more flexible in the end of the blade, so you can actually thrust safely with them, and they tend to have safety tips on. But we also train with sharp swords like this, whether it be cutting or just doing solo training, and some people do drilling and a controlled form of sparring with sharp swords as well. And by and large, reenactment swords are a bit like crowbars. The swords that they use in Battle of the Nations, for example, are really not at all like real swords. They're essentially a metal club, they're a metal bar. And this is not what a sword is. Even if you look at a falchion which is perhaps the most extreme sort of just bashing, designed to just transfer lots of force to the target type of sword, if you actually look at an antique falchion, they've got very thin edges, they're very sharp, they're designed to cut. They're not designed as bludgeons. If you want to bludgeon, you use a mace, which is a better bludgeon. There is no point using a sword as a bludgeon, as a club, when you could use a club. A warhammer or a mace or an axe is far better for transferring energy to the target than a blunt falchion is. The only real advantage to a blunt falchion is they're better balanced, so you can give repeated blows more quickly, and you can probably defend yourself a little bit better with them for the same reason, because they're balanced closer to the hand. So one of the problems with reenactment swords is that they're really very unlike real swords, but equally they're used completely unlike real swords, because they're not used to thrust at the face, they're not used in the same way at all really. And even in armoured fighting is mostly about bypassing the armour, offending the person inside the armour, not just hitting the armour. And most reenactment armoured fighting concentrates on just hitting the armour, which is not at all like real armoured fighting, unless we talk about using a mace or a poleaxe, where actually just hitting the armour might be useful. So there we go guys, the two main points, two main issues that I run into discussing historical armed combat with reenactors is number one, thrusting in general, but specifically thrusting at the face, which is very, very important in all historical fighting, and even just in understanding historical fighting, even just having an appreciation of it, being thrust at the face is incredibly important. Anybody doing any type of shield fighting and not including thrusting at the face is not really doing a historical style of shield use. And secondly is the fact that the weapons themselves are often quite dissimilar to real historical weapons, and they're used in a not a historical way. But just to finish off, just to reiterate, reenactment has a lot of things going for it, and there are some aspects of knowledge from reenactment that certainly HEMA can learn from. But there we go, just 2 points that I thought were worth mentioning in a short video. Cheers guys! Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.